There's a certain kind of quiet that settles deep in the woods of Maine, the kind that holds its breath and waits. It was in that quiet, under a sky the color of a fading bruise, that Claire Evans first laid eyes on Black Ridge Asylum. The grief for her mother was a heavy coat she couldn't take off, and the miles she'd put between herself and home had done little to lighten the load. The asylum, a grim Victorian silhouette against the pines, seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while. A place where the silence outside might finally quiet the noise within. The air grew colder as Claire's beat-up sedan rattled up the long, winding driveway. The building was even more imposing up close, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the encroaching twilight. A man with a tired face and a security badge that read Hank grunted a hello at the gate, his gaze lingering on her city plates before he waved her through. The front doors, heavy oak and iron, opened into a lobby that smelled of antiseptic and something else, something old and vaguely sweet, like dried flowers. The staff moved with a detached, almost dreamlike slowness. A woman at the reception desk, her hair pulled into a severe bun, handed Claire a set of keys and a clipboard without a word. It was Dr. Gideon Mercer who finally offered a handshake. He was a tall man, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "Welcome to Black Ridge, Miss Evans," he said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "We trust you'll find the work rewarding." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a coldness there, a clinical distance that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. It was another nurse, a young woman named Anna, with wide, frightened eyes, who showed Claire to her station. "You're on the night shift, then?" Anna asked, her voice barely a whisper. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. The pay was too good to pass up. "I just need a fresh start, you know." Anna's gaze flickered towards the locked ward at the end of the hall. "Just be careful," she said, her fingers twisting the fabric of her scrubs. "The nights here are long, longer than you think." Claire's first shift was a study in unsettling quiet. The patients, housed in single rooms behind thick reinforced doors, were unnervingly docile. They sat on their beds or stood at their windows, their eyes following her with a silent, unnerving intensity. The security measures were unlike any she'd seen in her years of nursing. Heavy steel doors with multiple locks, reinforced glass, and a complex system of cameras that monitored every inch of the ward. As she made her rounds, the feeling of being watched was a constant prickling presence on her skin. She told herself it was just first-night jitters, the strangeness of a new place. But as the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, a sense of dread began to coil in her stomach, tight and cold. The first chime of the grandfather clock in the lobby echoed through the silent halls, each toll a hammer blow against the quiet, and then as the 12th chime faded, it began. A low moan started from the far end of the ward, a sound of pure animalistic despair. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was thick with a chorus of incoherent muttering and guttural cries. A violent crash erupted from one of the rooms, the sound of a body hitting a door with brutal force. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. She rushed to the security monitors, her hands shaking as she tried to focus on the screens. What she saw made the breath catch in her throat. The docile, silent patients were transformed. A woman with vacant eyes now clawed at her own face, her nails leaving bloody tracks. A man who had sat placidly for hours now thrashed on his bed, his body contorted in an impossible, violent seizure. They screamed, not in pain, but in a kind of furious, desperate rage. Then the lights began to flicker. The security cameras fizzled, the screens dissolving into a cascade of static. In the strobing, intermittent darkness, Claire saw them, shadowy figures, tall and impossibly thin, lurking in the corners of the rooms, their forms indistinct and wavering. They seemed to whisper to the patients, their movements fluid and unnatural. Claire stumbled back from the monitors, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She was alone. The other night staff, 2 burly orderlies, were nowhere to be seen. The phone on the desk was dead, the line filled with a hissing static. She was trapped in a symphony of madness, the screams and crashes a relentless assault on her senses. She spent the rest of the night huddled in the nurse's station, her back pressed against the locked door, a heavy fire extinguisher clutched in her lap. She listened to the sounds of chaos, her mind reeling, trying to rationalize what she had seen. It was a mass psychotic episode, a shared delusion, a reaction to a change in medication. There had to be a logical explanation. And then, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the grimy windows, it stopped. As suddenly as it had begun, the ward fell silent. The screams died, the thrashing ceased. Claire, trembling, forced herself to look at the monitors, which had flickered back to life. The patients were back in their beds, calm and still. The rooms were in disarray, furniture overturned, walls scratched and dented, but the occupants were placid, their faces blank, as if the night's horrors had been nothing more than a bad dream. The shadowy figures were gone. As the sun rose higher, casting long golden shafts of light down the hallway, the asylum returned to its eerie, unsettling normal, leaving Claire shaken to her very core. The memory of the midnight madness burned into her mind. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and creeping dread. Claire moved through her daytime hours in a fog, the memory of the midnight chaos a stark contrast to the placid, almost catatonic state of the patients. She tried to talk to the other staff, to ask about the nightly occurrences, but her questions were met with blank stares and evasive answers. It was as if she were the only one who had witnessed the madness. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Claire began to explore the asylum during her off hours. The place was a labyrinth of forgotten wings and dusty, disused rooms. It was in the basement, a damp, cavernous space that smelled of earth and decay, that she found them, tucked away in a rusted filing cabinet, hidden beneath a pile of moldering linens, were old patient records, their pages brittle and yellowed with age. The records dated back decades to the asylum's founding. As Claire read, a story of horror began to unfold. The entries were filled with bizarre, unethical experiments, patients subjected to electroshock therapy without anesthetic, lobotomies performed with crude, unsterilized instruments, and strange ritualistic treatments involving sensory deprivation and hallucinogenic drugs. And then there were the disappearances, patient after patient, their files ending abruptly with a single chilling entry. Discharged, no forwarding address, no family contact, just a void where a life used to be. A floorboard creaked behind her. Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Anna, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. "You shouldn't be down here," Anna whispered, her eyes darting nervously towards the shadows. "Anna, what is this place?" Claire asked, her voice trembling as she held up one of the files. "What happened to these people?" Anna shook her head, her expression a mixture of fear and pity. "You need to leave, Claire. Leave and don't look back, before midnight traps you too." Before Claire could press her for more, Anna was gone, her footsteps echoing up the stone stairs. A cold knot of fear tightened in Claire's stomach. She knew she had to get out. She packed her bags, in a frenzy, her mind racing. She would drive until the sun came up, until Blackridge Asylum was nothing more than a bad memory. But when she got to her car, the engine wouldn't turn over. It sputtered and died, the battery inexplicably dead. Claire slammed her hands against the steering wheel, a wave of helpless frustration washing over her. She was stranded. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the asylum grounds, Claire knew with a sickening certainty that she would have to face another night within its walls. As the clock tower began its inexorable climb towards midnight, Claire found herself drawn not to the relative safety of the nurse's station, but back to the basement. Anna's warning, the old files, the dead car, it was all connected, a puzzle she had to solve if she was going to survive. Armed with a heavy flashlight, She descended into the damp, oppressive darkness. This time, she noticed a door she had missed before, a heavy iron door hidden behind a stack of old, discarded mattresses. It was unlocked. Pushing it open, she found herself in a narrow descending passageway, the air growing colder with every step. The passage opened into a large, circular chamber, the walls lined with strange, unsettling symbols carved into the stone. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something metallic and cloying. In the center of the room, a circle of candles cast a flickering, eerie glow. And then she heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the ward above. It was the patient's. But this was not the incoherent screaming of the previous nights. This was a language, ancient and guttural, a unified, hypnotic chorus that seemed to vibrate in the very stones around her. A figure emerged from the shadows on the far side of the chamber. It was Dr. Mercer. He was dressed in a dark, hooded robe, his face a mask of intense concentration. He moved to the center of the circle, his hands outstretched, his voice joining the chant, though his words were different, a commanding, authoritative tone that seemed to direct the chorus above. He was performing a ritual, communicating with something. As Claire watched, hidden in the darkness of the passageway, the air in the center of the chamber began to shimmer, to distort, like heat rising from asphalt. A presence, unseen but palpable, began to coalesce in the circle. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a wave of pure, undiluted fear washed over Claire, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. Dr. Mercer's chanting grew louder, more frantic. He was offering something to the presence, a tribute. He raised his hands, and in the flickering candlelight, Claire saw that he was holding a small silver locket, her locket, the one she kept on her bedside table, the one with the picture of her mother inside. He had been in her room. A floorboard creaked above her. The chanting stopped. Dr. Mercer's head snapped up, his eyes, now glowing with a faint, malevolent light, scanning the darkness. He knew he was not alone. Horrified, Claire scrambled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fled up the passageway, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the damp stone walls. She didn't stop running until she reached the relative safety of her own room, the sound of Dr. Mercer's enraged shout echoing from the depths of the asylum. She had seen the truth, and now it had seen her. The asylum was no longer just a place of employment. It was a prison, and the entity that dwelled within its walls now had its sights set on Claire. The days were a torment of sleepless anxiety, the nights a descent into a personalized hell. The entity had found the cracks in her soul, the raw, gaping wound of her grief, and it began to pry them open. She started seeing things. Her mother, standing at the end of the hall, her face a mask of disappointment. "You should have been there, Claire," she would whisper, her voice filled with a sorrow that cut deeper than any knife. "You let me die alone." The vision would flicker and dissolve, leaving Claire shaking and sobbing, the old guilt fresh and raw. The asylum itself seemed to conspire against her. Hallways would stretch into impossible lengths, doors would lead to brick walls, and her own reflection in the windows would twist into a leering, monstrous version of herself. Whispers slithered from the vents, voices of the patients she had read about in the old files, their spectral cries of pain and fear, a constant, tormenting soundtrack. She realized with dawning horror that the entity was a parasite of the mind. It fed on emotion, on grief, fear, and loneliness. It took the staff's personal traumas and amplified them, twisting their memories into weapons. It was why the other staff were so detached, so empty. They had been fed upon for so long that there was nothing left but hollow shells. Desperate, Claire sought out Anna, the only person who had shown her any kindness, any hint of understanding. But Anna was gone. Her room was empty, her belongings cleared out as if she had never existed. When Claire asked Dr. Mercer where she was, he simply smiled his cold, empty smile. "Miss Peterson decided her work here was done," he said, his eyes glinting with a triumphant, predatory light. She was discharged. The word hung in the air, cold and final. Claire knew then that Anna hadn't left. She had become another name in the long hidden history of the asylum's victims, another sacrifice to the thing that dwelled in the dark. The realization hit Claire with the force of a physical blow. She was truly alone now, a lamb in a slaughterhouse, and the butcher was sharpening his knives. The entity was no longer content to just feed on her fear. It wanted to consume her entirely. A new, frantic energy seized Claire. Grief and fear were still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but now they were joined by a spark of anger, a desperate will to survive. She had to find a way to fight back, and that meant understanding what she was up against. If Anna was gone, she must have left something behind, a clue, a warning. Claire broke into Anna's now vacant room, her hands shaking as she picked the lock. The room was sterile, impersonal, but Claire's instincts screamed that something was there. She tore the room apart, pulling up floorboards, checking behind the loose wallpaper, her search growing more desperate with every passing minute. Finally, tucked into a slit in the mattress, her fingers closed around a small, leather-bound journal. Anna's handwriting was a frantic scrawl, the pages filled with a story of escalating terror. She had been piecing together the asylum's history, just as Claire had. The founders of Blackridge, a cabal of wealthy occultists in the late 19th century, hadn't built an asylum to heal the sick. They had built a prison. They had summoned an ancient non-corporeal entity, a being of immense power that fed on human misery, and trapped it within the asylum's walls, hoping to harness its power for their own gain. But the entity was too strong. It had twisted their ritual, turning its prison into its kingdom. It couldn't leave, but it could control everything and everyone within the asylum's grounds. The founders became its first puppets, their families its first meals. Dr. Mercer was just the latest in a long line of chief psychiatrists who served as the entity's high priest, the conduit for its will. The journal confirmed Claire's darkest fears. The nightly ritual wasn't just a communication, it was a feeding. The entity drove the patients mad with fear and despair, siphoning off the raw, potent energy. But it needed more. To maintain its power, to keep its hold on the physical world, it required regular sacrifices, patients and staff who were deemed suitable, those with deep, unresolved traumas, with powerful emotional vulnerabilities, people like Anna, people like Claire. The final entry in the journal was dated the day Anna disappeared. "It wants me," she had written, the words shaky and blurred by what could have been tears. "Mercer told me tonight is the night. It's hungry. Claire is next. Her grief is so pure, so strong. It wants her more than any of us. God help her. God help us all." Claire dropped the journal, the truth a cold, heavy weight in her gut. She wasn't just being haunted. She was being hunted. She was the main course in a feast of souls, and her sacrifice was scheduled for that very night. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, the asylum's atmosphere shifted. The usual pre-midnight tension was gone, replaced by a thrumming, predatory energy. The entity was awake, and it was hungry. This time, the madness didn't wait for the clock to strike 12. A blood-curdling scream echoed from the ward, sharp and final. Claire rushed to the monitors to see one of the orderlies, a large man named Frank, being torn apart by a group of patients. Their eyes glowed with the same malevolent light she had seen in Dr. Mercer's, their movements unnaturally fast and coordinated. They were no longer just victims of the entity. They were its extensions, its claws and teeth. Chaos erupted. The remaining staff, their minds already weakened and frayed, were no match for the possessed patients. They were hunted down, their screams echoing through the halls before being abruptly silenced. The asylum had become a charnel house. Claire ran. She knew with chilling certainty that Dr. Mercer was orchestrating this, clearing the board, isolating her for the final act. Her only hope was to escape, to get beyond the asylum's grounds, beyond the entity's reach. She sprinted for the front doors, her lungs burning, the sounds of slaughter at her back. But when she reached the lobby, she skidded to a halt. The layout had changed. The grand staircase was gone, replaced by a solid wall of weeping stone. The front doors had vanished, the space they once occupied now a long dark corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The asylum was alive, a shape-shifting prison designed to entrap her. She tried another route, a service hallway that should have led to a back exit, but now twisted back on itself, leading her right back to the lobby. Every escape route was a dead end, every corridor a loop. The entity was playing with her, savoring her terror, feeding on her despair as an appetizer for the main course. She was trapped, a mouse in a maze with a monster at its center, and the monster was calling her name. Dr. Mercer's voice, amplified by the asylum's unnatural acoustics, echoed from all directions. "It's time, Claire. Don't keep us waiting. Your grief will be a gift, a key. It will set us all free." Claire pressed herself into a darkened alcove, her body trembling uncontrollably. He wasn't just going to sacrifice her. He was going to use her, use the raw power of her loss, to break the bonds that held the entity to this place. Her death would not just feed the beast, it would unleash it upon the world. There was nowhere left to run. The asylum had sealed itself, and the disembodied voice of Dr. Mercer guided her, a shepherd leading his lamb to the slaughter. The only path that remained open was the one that led down, back to the basement, back to the ritual chamber. With a deep, shuddering breath, Claire descended into the darkness, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her anger a burning coal in her heart. The scene in the chamber was a tableau from a nightmare. The candles burned brighter, their flames casting dancing, grotesque shadows on the walls. In the center of the circle, an altar of black stone had risen from the floor, a terrified patient, one of the few survivors of the upstairs massacre, bound tightly upon it. Dr. Mercer stood before the altar, his arms raised, the silver locket clutched in his hand. He was no longer the enigmatic psychiatrist. His body was a vessel, his eyes burning with an ancient, inhuman intelligence. The air crackled with power, the entity's presence so thick it was almost suffocating. "Claire," the thing wearing Mercer's face said, its voice a layered chorus of whispers. "You have come. You feel it, don't you? The power in this place, the power of your own sorrow. It is beautiful, potent." It gestured to the locket. "Your mother? Such a tragic loss, so much pain, so much potential. Give it to us. Let us taste it. Let it be the key that unlocks the final door." The entity's influence washed over her, a tide of despair. It dredged up every painful memory, every moment of guilt and regret. The image of her mother, frail and fading in a hospital bed, flashed before her eyes, the feeling of helplessness, of failure. The grief was a physical weight, threatening to crush her, to pull her down into the abyss the entity had prepared for her. She stumbled forward, her will beginning to crumble. This was it. This was the end. She would be consumed, her pain used to unleash a torrent of evil upon the world. But then another memory surfaced, not of her mother's death, but of her life. Her mother, laughing in the garden, her face bright with sunshine. Her mother, holding her close after a childhood nightmare, her voice a bastion of strength and comfort. "Don't you ever let them see you cry, Claire Bear," she used to say. "Your strength is your own. Don't ever give it away." The words, a forgotten echo from her childhood, cut through the fog of despair. Her grief was not a weakness. It was a testament to her love. Her pain was her own, a sacred, terrible thing that this parasite had no right to touch. "No," Claire whispered, the word a spark in the darkness. The entity recoiled as if struck. "What?" "I said no." Claire's voice was stronger now, fueled by a surge of righteous anger. She looked at the locket, at the image of the woman who had taught her to be strong. She wasn't a victim. She was her mother's daughter. "My grief is not for you," she snarled, her eyes locking with Mercer's. "My pain is not your food. My love is not your key." She focused on the memory of her mother's strength, on the fierce, unconditional love she had felt. She held it in her mind, a shield of light against the encroaching darkness. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure fury and frustration. The connection, the emotional hook it had sunk into her, was dissolving. Claire's refusal to surrender her grief, her choice to embrace the strength within her sorrow, was starving it. It was a poison to the parasite. The power in the room began to wane, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as Claire stood her ground, a beacon of defiance in the heart of the nightmare. The entity's hold was broken. As Claire's emotional resilience flared, the power in the ritual chamber sputtered like a dying flame. The possessed Dr. Mercer cried out, his body convulsing as the malevolent force within him recoiled from the unexpected purity of Claire's defiance. The candles around the circle flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness. Seizing the moment, Claire grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from the edge of the room and lunged forward. With a cry of rage, she brought it down on the stone altar, the impact echoing like a gunshot. The altar cracked, the ritual focus shattered. A wave of energy erupted from it, throwing both Claire and Mercer back. The patient on the altar, freed from the psychic bonds, scrambled away, his eyes wide with terror. Above them, the asylum seemed to groan in agony. The psychic backlash from the broken ritual was tearing the place apart. The unified consciousness that had controlled the patients shattered, and chaos erupted. Some collapsed, their bodies limp, while others, driven truly mad by the night's events, began to fight each other, their screams a cacophony of pain and confusion. Flames began to lick up the walls of the chamber, ignited by overturned torches. The fire spread with unnatural speed, feeding on the dry, ancient wood of the asylum. The entity was weakened, its prison burning down around it. But it was not yet gone. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the smoke-filled air, a promise of vengeance. Claire didn't wait to hear more. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the arm of the patient she had freed. "We have to go, now!" They fought their way up from the basement, through a madhouse of fire and fighting. The impossible architecture of the asylum was crumbling, the hallways and doors returning to their normal, mundane configurations. The front doors, once vanished, were now visible through the thick, black smoke. Claire burst out into the pre-dawn air, dragging the dazed patient with Ta. They collapsed on the damp grass, gasping for breath, the heat of the inferno at their backs. The Blackridge Asylum was a funeral pyre, the flames reaching for the sky, a beacon of destruction in the heart of the Maine woods. As the first rays of the sun crested the horizon, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of orange and pink, a profound sense of exhaustion and victory washed over Claire. She had faced the darkness, both within herself and in the asylum, and she had survived. She was scarred, haunted, but she was whole. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Claire watched the asylum burn, the dawn a promise of a new, albeit uncertain, day. In the weeks that followed, Claire found herself in a different kind of institution, a clean, bright, and thoroughly skeptical hospital. She told her story, again and again, to doctors, to police, to officials in dark suits. She spoke of the midnight madness, of Dr. Mercer and the ritual, of the entity that fed on fear. They listened patiently, nodding and taking notes, their faces a mixture of pity and professional concern. The official story was neat and tidy. A tragic fire caused by faulty wiring. A riot sparked by a handful of dangerously unstable patients. Dr. Gideon Mercer, a hero who had died trying to save them. Anna Peterson, a disgruntled nurse who had quit weeks before the incident. The other missing staff and patients were accounted for with bureaucratic sleight of hand. Transfers and discharges forged to fill the gaps. The final report called Claire a survivor suffering from severe post-traumatic stress, her testimony a product of a grief-stricken mind trying to make sense of an unspeakable tragedy. They offered her therapy, medication, a quiet room where she could recover from her delusions. Claire knew the truth. She carried it in the new hard-won strength in her eyes, in the quiet confidence that had replaced her fear. She had been to the edge of the abyss and had refused to fall. She was no longer just a survivor of loss, but a survivor of a darkness few could imagine. She left the hospital, the official report clutched in her hand, a testament to a world that refused to see what lay just beneath the surface. Sometimes, late at night, she would look at the news, searching for any mention of Black Ridge. The stories were always the same: a tragic accident, a community in mourning. But Claire knew better. She knew that the entity, though weakened and wounded, was not destroyed. It was tied to that land, to the ashes and ruins of its prison. It was sleeping, perhaps, healing in the darkness. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was waiting for the right kind of fear, the right kind of grief, to once again draw it from its slumber, ready to rise from the ruins when the world was least expecting it. The night shift at Black Ridge was over, but the watch had just begun.